We've been telling ourselves a very flattering story that humans are special, separate, and superior to all other animals. In this episode of Wild Connection, primatologist and author Dr. Christine Webb joins me to talk about why that story is scientifically wrong and how human exceptionalism influences our language, our politics, and even the way we study other species. We talk about mountain gorillas who clearly don't think we're very impressive, baboons that show empathy, and why I say I don't anthropomorphize animals, I zoomorphize people. You're listening to Wild Connection, where every conversation is a journey into what it means to be part of this wild and complicated world. I'm your host, Dr. Jen, and I talk with scientists, authors, and changemakers about people, nature, and the surprising connections that tie us all together. Hey everybody, welcome back to Wild Connection, the podcast that explores how our relationships with other species can transform how we live, love, and build community. Today, I'm talking with primatologist Dr. Christine Webb, an assistant professor in environmental studies at NYU, about her new book, An Arrogant Ape. In it, she takes aim at human exceptionalism, the idea that we sit above and apart from the rest of life, and shows how that belief is integrated into our science, our politics, our language, and even our day-to-day habits. Christine shares how growing up befriending the animals in her backyard and discovering evolutionary biology gave scientific weight to that childhood sense of closeness with other animals that her and I both share. We look at what happens when we stop pretending there's a clean line between humans and other animals, how that shift changes the questions we ask, and why it might be critical for facing the ecological crisis we've created. So, if you've ever felt that other species have something to teach us about being human, which I clearly think they do, then you are going to love this conversation. Welcome back to Wild Connection. I'm with Dr. Christine Webb. Thank you so much for joining us, Christine.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
I am really excited to talk to you because your new book, An Arrogant Ape, has come out, and we're going to talk about as much as we can in the time that we have. But one of the things I like to do for the audience is to get a sense of who the guest is. And so would you be able to share a little bit about your background, how you came to study primatology and that relationship between humans and other animals?
Absolutely. I grew up as an animal lover, as many of us can relate to. I loved spending time outdoors, befriending the beings who lived in my backyard and near the playground at our school. When I entered middle and high school, I was really lucky to have incredible science teachers, wonderful biology teachers in particular. And when we started reading Darwin, we read excerpts from On the Origin of Species, and we're learning about evolutionary theory. I was really moved because it gave a scientific authority to that childlike sense of kinship I had had with other forms of life. It said, no, actually, this is true. We all evolved from common origins. We're interdependent. We're related. And then I knew I wanted to study evolution in some capacity. Fast forward to university, I had the privilege of taking a class with the primatologist Franz de Waal. I went to Emory, which is where he was based. And I loved that class so much. And I didn't realize until then that spending time with other animals was something that you could actually turn into a career and get paid to do. And looking back on it now, it's so clear in some ways why I became a primatologist, not just because of all these circumstances, having, the privilege of spending time outdoors and great science teachers and mentors like Franz de Waal, but I've always been interested in challenging the supposed human animal divide. Always wondered what animals were thinking and feeling and how they're so similar to us, or even if they're so different that they're complex and nuanced and minded in ways that are equally interesting but perhaps different. And I think primatology is a great place to really start to trouble that supposed divide because they're our closest living relatives.
Yeah. Wow. It's so interesting. So we have a lot of similarities. I grew up loving animals, wanting to be around them because I felt like I wanted to learn something from them. I felt like there was something for me to learn about being me from them. And I never really was able to articulate that very well until later. And I didn't even know that it was a job that you could also do. And I was very interested in primates, and but I ended up for my PhD studying prairie dogs, and then I sort of fell madly in love with prairie dogs for a long period of time. They're so interesting, and that's where I started thinking about more and more, how do I bridge that gap between how we see other animals and how we see ourselves? And this is what really
Mhm.
drew me to your book, because you put human exceptionalism front and center in that conversation in An Arrogant Ape. And for a long time, I've been fond of saying I zoomorphize people. I don't anthropomorphize animals, because we are animals. And that is something you really think about in this book. And I was wondering, what made you choose this topic, An Arrogant Ape? And you're referring to us, the humans, as the arrogant ape. So what made you decide to, focus on that for this project?
Yeah. So I taught a class of the same name. It was called The Arrogant Ape at Harvard for a number of years, an undergrad upper level seminar class. So very small group of us would meet weekly. And I was in the human evolutionary biology department at the time, which is focused on this question of what makes us human. And it was my experience that answers to that question often centered on some really positive characteristic, our unique ingenuity or virtue or moral systems, even when it came to things like our unique locomotion or gut microbiome or dentition. I was kind of struck by the dominant narrative around, okay, this is what makes humans special, but what about what we're doing to the environment? How can we ignore this massive issue that is ongoing and seems to not be moving in the right direction whatsoever, even though we've known that climate change is a problem for decades? We're not taking the actions necessary to mitigate it. And so I knew I wanted to teach a class that kind of told another side of the human story. Um, and and it quickly became clear to me in that class that when we're talking about the arrogant ape, we're not talking about a species-wide characteristic or necessarily even a dominant cultural characteristic. We're talking about a particular character, a particular kind or way of being human. And in that class, I saw how engaging with human exceptionalism, learning to see all of the ways this ideology or worldview has infiltrated our lives, from our language to our politics to our schools and textbooks to our economic systems, our food systems, and our religious sermons, our advertising, so many different fields, and not just that, but also our sciences, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point. I saw how when students learned to see how human exceptionalism had seeped into all of these facets of their lives, it really started to change their experiences of the world. It changed their beliefs about the world. It transformed how they moved in the world and how they acted in the world. The same was happening for me too. We were all imbued with this renewed sense of kind of going back to childhood, like a sense of kinship and awe and wonder. And I didn't want to let that go. And it felt so powerful and transformative. And I think it's also really important for our science and for our general way of life that I knew I wanted to turn these ideas and these discussions into a book.
I'm really glad that you did. And it's an exceptional book, not to use the word exceptionalism, is an exceptional book in that, it does talk about all the ways in which this emerges, even if we're not thinking about it. And it's similar to how I thought, why do we always refer to an animal that we don't know its biological sex as he? It's sort of an
Mhm.
automatic. He was
Mhm.
moving. Okay, it could have been a she. We don't know, but it's
Or
just
we say it.
yeah, wait, or yeah, and but it's sort of the way that we've been kind of indoctrinated to think about, talk about all the language that surrounds that, and then not realizing how that influences our thinking in our day-to-day interactions with other species. And I will just say anecdotally, my impression from mountain gorillas is that I don't think they think we're terribly exceptional. In general, I think they find us pretty weak, sometimes irritating, and generally
Mhm.
incompetent at moving around in the forest. I mean, I don't know how many times I've flown around like an egg and and the look on their faces, I'm not even going to bother trying to make my point to this creature who can't even stand up straight in this environment, right? Like this is so ridiculous. So when I think about anthropomorphism and thinking about it in terms of our science, right? I mean, Darwin, he clearly felt strongly that other animals had emotions and a mind. And then that kind of got undone and early in my own career, and you talk about this in the book, I learned that this was a cardinal sin. And it meant you were doing bad science. Number
Yeah.
one. And so
Yeah.
this idea that acknowledging the complexity and the capacities of other animals to think and feel and plan and desire in some way anything that they want for their life. Where did that emerge that discussing that was bad science?
Mm. There's a long history there. And as Darwin and many others have pointed out, all you need to do is spend a lot of time with another animal and it will dispel any notion of human exceptionalism because you really get to know that they have incredibly complex subjective experiences and lives. But if we want to look at how discussion of those experiences and emotional lives became taboo in a scientific context, then we need to look really far back within Western history, even going back to like Greek and Hellenistic thought, Aristotelian notions of a hierarchy of being with humans at the top. Versions of this are also called the Great Chain of Being in medieval Christianity, where humans alone, had rationality and language and souls. You can see this throughout the Enlightenment and all of these forces that kind of led up to the development of contemporary Western science imposed a kind of hierarchical divide between humans and other animals, often on the basis of some mental characteristic like consciousness or reason or language. And then there were other currents within science, including the rise of behaviorism, logical positivism, which really said that, okay, maybe other animals have mental lives, but those lives are not amenable to scientific study. We can't say anything objective about that. They're qualitative experiences. We can't quantify them. And so the mind is like a black box. And to some extent, this was true for the study of human beings as well. We can only focus on behavior. But later, the cognitive revolution really challenged that notion. We have to understand human beings more holistically than just through their behavior. We have to take their psychology very seriously. And to some extent, that revolution, that cognitive revolution, didn't take as much hold when it came to the study of other animals, ethology. We still have this like lingering behaviorism, all of the prohibition in science against talking about the thoughts and the feelings of other animals are still present. I mean, if both of us experience this in our scientific training, my undergrads today still experience this in their scientific training, that it's not good science to interpret or to attempt to interpret what is going on inside the mind of another animal. And that we're somehow always, when we do that, we're somehow always projecting human values and beliefs and interests onto those minds. And, as I argue in the book, that there's really a lot of harm that is done to science and even to this whole notion of objectivity in the process of that denial.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much I want to unpack in that, but I think my entry point will be it's a short story you tell about Bear, but can you talk about Bear, the baboon, and that moment you had a recognition of something that really speaks to this idea of really being able to understand the mind of another animal, even if we're not going to write a paper scientifically about it.
Mhm. Yes.
Sorry.
And it's all along the way been the other animals who've been the best teachers and have taught me to rethink my assumptions. So Bear is one of these animals, and he is a Chacma baboon living in the Namib Desert. At the time, he was a juvenile baboon, and like many male juvenile baboons, was causing a lot of disruption, both within his own social group and also with the team of field researchers following his troop that summer. And one day, his antics got a little bit out of hand. So a bunch of baboons surrounded my colleague, and they were barking and slapping her legs. And it was a very tense moment. It wasn't clear exactly what happened, but that Bear was one of the instigators. And, he had done things like this before, but this time a bunch of other baboons congregated, and it escalated to a point that we were afraid for our safety, and ended up being okay. The baboons at some point, stopped, but we were so concerned about the kind of escalation that we thought maybe we shouldn't follow this troop anymore, give it a rest. But we decided, okay, we'll continue to follow them, but we'll do so at a much greater distance. And so the next day, I was with the same troop. I was with Bear's troop, and over the ridge comes Bear and an entourage of baboons. And this time they were making a beeline for me. And I was in a very precarious position. I was kind of off balance, and I was wobbling down this steep, rocky incline. And so I couldn't get out of their way. I kind of had to stay in the line of attack. So I just tried to remain very calm. Deep down, I was terrified, but I, on the surface, tried to look relaxed. And Bear approached. When he got right up next to me, he put his hand in between my hiking boots, and he looked up at me, and he bared his teeth into this very awkward, forced grimace. And I remember it so clearly because I had never seen baboon teeth that up close before, and they were so perfect and white and square. And I couldn't believe it, actually, because as a primatologist, I know that this is a pacifying gesture. This is something that baboons do to appease one another, avert conflicts with one another. And not only do I believe that Bear was, exhibiting a form of empathy, he knew, despite my intention to hide it, that I was actually terrified, and was trying to say, okay, no need to be fearful. But I believe he also had to know what I knew about what had happened the day before, and that he was trying to make amends for it. Like, look, things got a little out of hand yesterday. I've noticed you're following me from really far away, but that's not, and I see you're very scared right now, but that is not necessary. And, it was this really profound moment. I almost couldn't believe it had happened. I told my colleagues, and no one really could believe what had happened, because I had never had a baboon engage with me in this particular way, even though they've engaged with other baboons, and I've seen this behavior many times, and I know what it signifies. And when I was reflecting on it, I recalled how many times I had been told as a graduate student that humans alone have a theory of mind, that baboons and other primates do not have a theory of mind. They don't have this ability to know what others know or to feel what others feel. And Bear taught me otherwise. And, he, again, is just one of many examples, I believe, of other animals teaching us something through the relationships that we have with them. And that is another big theme that I explore in the book, is how if we really want to come to understand the minded life of another being, then we can't detach ourselves and remove ourselves according to these scientific norms and conventions. Actually, we have to engage with them as participants in a shared world. And that is the way that we truly come to know who they are.
Yeah. Wow. That's really powerful. And I think it's almost like really learning another language, right? And to understand the many miscommunications happen between people who even speak the same language, or between people and their companion animals. It can happen. And I have a very different story, but similar in the sense that it was clear to me that this individual gorilla was misunderstanding a situation, and then realized they misunderstood the situation. So it was a male who had secured a new female, and they're super possessive. He's a typically possessive, high jealousy kind of male anyway. That's just his nature. If you spend any time, he's very reactive to everything. So he had moved away from her and knew that I was there with some other people with her. We were the last people to have been with her. So our time was up and we were leaving, and he was returning to where he had left her, but she was no longer there. She had moved. So we're leaving, just chit chatting away. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he had tracked us and was on a full charge, screaming. And I thought it was a wild gorilla. Like I was literally not habituated when I thought, oh God, what is this? It was a blur, just swirling around the front, coming around the side, full volume, and then abruptly stopped. Like we froze because you don't run. I mean, it's impossible anyway. So, and to the gorilla mind, if you run, you must have done whatever, you must have done something.
Yep.
Therefore, otherwise you wouldn't run.
Yep.
Why would you? Right. But for us, it could be like run and no. So knowing how other species think about a certain action is very, very important, as you were discussing. So but then you saw on his face this confusion. Like whatever it was that he thought was happening was not happening, and could see it. And then he sat down, and he just sat down, sort of mystified about the situation. And we decided to slowly move. And I said, I don't want to be last. That's all I said, is I don't want to be last in the. But I realized several things that day, which one was that other animals can misunderstand an entire situation. And then that they can understand that they misunderstand and adjust even in a high reactive, enraged moment, or what I envision as enraged. If you think we took your female or we did something to your female, to immediately cease and sit down and now consider what is going on. I don't even
Yeah, that's
any
incredible.
people.
That kind of like meta, it's a kind of metacognition, like knowing things that you know for sure, knowing things that maybe you don't know or were wrong about. And then it reminds me, the dog cognition researcher Alexandra Horowitz once told me that, she thinks of dogs as being anthropologists, in that they study human behavior so carefully. And I think about this with other primates, who we're working with as well. Like they are studying us. They are anthropologists in their own right. And so of course I mean, just as with any human to human or human to animal relationship, there's going to be conflicts, there's going to be misunderstandings, but there is that capacity to really study and try to understand and observe the behaviors of the human and other primates around them. I think it's an incredible capability that we often um, we often don't appreciate. And it's interesting that in both of our experiences, it sort of came through like a misunderstanding or a conflict, that then required some resolution and working through. And that's also how we come to know other human beings. And the healthiest relationships are often characterized by that kind of misunderstanding, conflict, and then reconciliation and restoring tolerance and understanding to some baseline level. That's part of what it means to be in a dynamic relationship.
Right, to be in relationship with anything. And I want to talk about this bias that we have towards this importance of humans over all other species, and whether it's something we're born with or whether it's something we learn. But just briefly, I'm reminded of Robin Dunbar. He was on the show, and he told me he almost studied gorillas, mountain gorillas, but that there was a researcher who told him there was a day that a silverback started charging downhill, and that there was a moment where the gorilla realized it couldn't stop, and the researcher realized the gorilla couldn't stop. And he just got run over. But it was like, I don't mean to do this. I
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
stop. And that one couldn't get out of the way. And so I was just reminded of that, like we even know when accidents are going to happen. If I'm going to fall and all of a sudden I look at you and I'm sort of expressing I can't stop my motion, and you realize, oh no, the motion is happening, I can't get out of the way. This is also
Yeah.
another.
That's an incredible story, and I don't know, it reminds me of times when I've seen baboons do something quite silly, like they will be climbing and then they'll very non-elegantly, like, tumble to the ground, and then they'll kinda look up at me as if to say, "Did you see that? You didn't see that, did you? Like, what just happened?" It's there's this kind of shared recognition there in the same way that the gorilla barreling towards this researcher. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but you see it too, right? So better get out of the way. Like there are so many idiosyncrasies like this. I mean, it's again, if you go to any primatology conference and you look at what the conversations are outside of the big lecture halls and symposia, then it's it's all of these kinds of encounters.
Yeah, and do you think that the average person, they seem to recognize it with their own, like dogs or cats, but like where do you think we learn to be biased, that we're so exceptional, or is it something we're born with?
I mean, many people assume that human exceptionalism is just inherent to being human, that like we inevitably prioritize members of our own species over members of other species, and that this is true all around the world. Humans everywhere tend to value and care about humans more than non human life. But there have been a number of studies in cross cultural and in developmental psychology that put these ideas to the test. And they actually suggest that human exceptionalism is not a bias that is inborn. It's not something that we come into the world wearing. So, in one of my favorite studies, researchers at Yale presented American children and adults with moral dilemma scenarios that pitted varying numbers of humans against varying numbers of either dogs or pigs. So essentially, you give them a moral dilemma scenario. There's two sinking ships, and the ships contained either human or other animal passengers who could not swim. And then the participants had to choose one ship that they could save. And whereas American adults almost always opted to save one human over even 100 dogs or pigs, children did not exhibit this same human centric bias. So they often would opt to save the life of a dog as much as the life of a human. And so they valued human and non human life much more similarly. And that study, or the general finding, has been replicated now in a number of other countries. And they suggest that human exceptionalism is not something that's intrinsic to our biological makeup as human beings. It's instead something that we learn. The authors of that particular study claim that children come to learn to prioritize humans over other animals only as they enter into the kind of main social fabric of the society and learn all the ways that humans use and exploit other animals. So the children in that study were, I believe they were like 5 to 9 years old. So they were right before kind of adolescence and that really becoming enculturated, becoming real members of the kind of culture in the US. And yeah, it's a really interesting set of findings. Certainly kind of tracks with my own, like what we were talking about, our own experiences of childhood affinity for other animals and nature more generally. And then I'll just say very briefly on the cross cultural side, there's all sorts of interesting ethnographic work and anthropological work looking at belief systems and values across human societies, past and present. And there are many human cultures who are around today who do not uphold a hierarchical divide between human and animal or between human culture and nature. That this is a hierarchical worldview that is embedded within, I would say, Western industrialized cultures, perhaps other industrialized cultures, but it's not universal.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I also agree with that. And that's my experience, in my own work when I teach wildlife conservation and culture, looking at how other cultures represent their relationship, the relationship between themselves and each other and other species and the environment in general. And yet we've seemed to have codified this hierarchical thinking and categorization, not just limiting it to other species, but within our own species, and it's
Mhm.
in our scientific, social, cultural, and governmental systems. And I think about how other cultures, how they define who they are in relation to all these other things. And there's also this cognitive dissonance, and you bring this up in the book, thinking about the language that we use, right? The words that we use to describe other species, our relationship with them. And here where I am in southwestern Uganda, there's a belief that it's a real cognitive dissonance for me. Like if you kill an animal in the presence of another animal, it's torture. And so they don't agree with the idea of like a slaughterhouse, right? Like this is abhorrent to them. And they don't name animals that they eat, because when I've inquired why not, they said, but then we would never eat them if we've given them a name. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. And yet, so they don't want to torture them in death, but they sort of are willing to torture them on a daily basis, without much thought. And the line for them is at the moment of death, and not because there's a compassion for the other animal, but because they think that a scared animal will affect the way the meat tastes.
Yeah.
So it's still
Yeah.
very human centric, right? It's completely human centric. Like we don't want to torture it, not because it's bad to torture, but because it'll affect the way the meat is, and we don't want that. So
Mhm.
I and then you have other cultures where there is no separation, meaning even if you eat another animal, then you're embodying a part of that animal in yourself, and you have a responsibility to other creatures and in this shared sort of experience of life. And I'm wondering, do you think that there's any way for us in for lack of a better word, or maybe you have a better word, contemporary society and the way we've organized our life, to connect differently, authentically connect differently, and and hold space for the terrible things that we do to each other, the environment, and other species? Like, how do we
Mhm.
sit with all of that in any given moment
Mhm.
without wanting to distance ourselves from it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right to point out a link between human exceptionalism vis-a-vis other species and the ways in which dehumanization operates within our own species. And that even if you look at the history of these hierarchies of life that I mentioned, Aristotle, Scala Naturae, the great chain of being, they haven't placed all human beings on a par. They've ranked human beings accordingly. So enslaved people and women, for instance, ranked below the Greek white male ideal archetype, and that supposedly subhuman human groups, they didn't count as fully human at all. And it's very interesting to me to think about the ways that something like anthropocentrism or human exceptionalism acts to kind of reinforce other forms of discrimination against human beings, sexism and racism. And there's so much interesting literature and studies on this. And it's again really important that when we talk about these different forms of discrimination, we're not saying that they're the exact same thing. We're not comparing the unique experiences of their victims or the histories that are involved in these different forms of subjugation, but we're recognizing the ways in which they come from common roots, where there's this supposed divide between who gets to count as human and who is an animal or who's more animal-like. And that can be an incredibly, I think, enriching theoretical frame for all of these different forms of discrimination to work through. And then we're thinking about, the ways in which we're instrumentalizing other forms of life. In English, we have all of this language that we use to deal with that cognitive dissonance. We don't talk about cows or pigs. We talk about beef and pork. We use terms like natural resources and ecosystem services, which kind of frame nature as this commodity rather than, our neighbor, our lifeline. And we talked about the pronouns earlier. We tend to use impersonal pronouns when we talk about other forms of life. And coming back to anthropomorphism, there's all sorts of ways that we don't use emotionally balanced terms or experiences to talk about their lives. Again, are really focused on behavior. So I think one of the ways that we can kind of start to sort our way through this mess is to just, for one, rethink the words that we're using when we're describing other forms of life. I mean, the words are a reflection of our relationship. And so maybe we shouldn't use these euphemisms like pork or cow, right? We should talk about, no, these are cows. Sorry, pork or beef. We should say these are cows. These are pigs. And in industrialized contexts, those slaughterhouses that you mentioned, they're carefully and intentionally hidden from the public eye. So are scientific laboratories. So are other places where animals are harmed in the name of human supposed benefit or science. And that kind of helps deal with the emotional, ethical dissonance that would arise if we were more directly involved in the practices of taking a life for our own consumption. And so I would say that is another huge thing that would need to change. We would need to understand, okay, this is not just chicken breast at the grocery store behind some plastic wrap. It's like, no, there was a life here. And by making ourselves more aware of that entire process from start to finish. I mean, first of all, most of us would probably never consume a chicken who was raised in such an environment. But that's not to say that there wouldn't be other kinds of relationships and situations possible for people. And you were pointing just to some of those that maybe are still inherently human exceptionalists, but that there's different social norms and conventions about how we consume and how we take life. And then I'll just say that in the sort of context you were referring to last, where maybe there's not this hierarchical divide in the way that it is in these other societies. I think one of the key distinctions there is that the ethical landscape is not just determined by human beings in those societies, that there is a sense in which other forms of life can impose constraints on human consumption and human behavior, and vice versa, and that the ethical there's a negotiation that happens between humans and other forms of life around consumption for food and for purposes. And that is a key difference. When in the, where you are, what you were talking about, the society is like very focused on humans are making these decisions about other animals' lives. What decisions are those animals making about how humans live? And it's in those societies where that relationship is possible that I think we see a less hierarchical and sustainable, but a more sustainable way of around them and with them. Yeah.
What's funny, because I was thinking about as you were talking in this last moment of other animals can impose ways on humans living. Two things occurred to me. One, definitely gorillas impose constraints on your behavior. And if you fail to follow the rules, they will communicate very clearly that, in fact, this was not the way you should behave. And then I thought about my cat. I like to, he was born Buttons, but he died Senor Antonio Botones Gatos. He had a big life. And part of his big life was organizing my schedule. Uh, and it really, he managed inadvertently to train me to deliver whatever it was he needed at any moment: tent time, uh, patio time, dinner time, bedtime, all the times. And, and I was fine with it. Not really, but I did it anyway because arguing with him was pointless. He was much more capable of persistence than me. And I think about something you wrote, and I'll kind of choose this to close our time because I know you're really busy and I could stay here for a long time. But you wrote that the human-centric worldview deprives us of richer and more meaningful experiences in the here and now, of childlike attention and scrutiny of tiny creatures, and of feeling connected to something greater than the self. And one of the reasons why I love studying animal behavior and being with other animals is I feel fully present in every moment. You can't do it and not be present. It's not possible. And I think about where a lot of, I'll just say the United States, because you talked a little bit about indigenous populations and other animals being sensitive to addictive substances. And I feel like, and this is my opinion, and I'd love to know what you think, that our disconnection from the natural world and all its forms, small and big, are creating a sense of dis-ease in people that they can't quite put their finger on, and they soothe with, let's say in the United States, substances to check out of the experience of being so disconnected. That's sort I don't know. What are you
Oh, it's
about that?
yes. Wow. There's several threads there I want to pull on. So one, you mentioned these addiction studies that I mentioned in the book. So just to clarify a little bit more about that, because I think they provide some context for this question. Those studies on addiction in other animals, I think it was in the 1960s, were studying rats living in Skinner boxes and these tiny little shoebox cages, and giving them levers where they could self-administer morphine or other opioids, drugs, and then they could also self-administer food and water. And in these deprived social and physical environments, studies would show that the rats would just forego food and water to keep giving themselves a hit of morphine or cocaine, and that this was taken as evidence. It was like Nixon's war on drugs at the time, that these substances are inherently addicting and really need to be carefully regulated and monitored. This guy Bruce Alexander came in and he decided to build something he called Rat Park, which was not at all a Skinner box, but he kept rats in these highly enriched social and physical environments where they had all these climbing structures and they had materials for nesting and burrowing. They lived among other rats. And then you place these levers in Rat Park. And what happens? Do the rats basically kill themselves through overdosing? No, they do not. They actually consume, I believe in one of his studies, 10 times less morphine and other drugs as the rats in these traditional Skinner boxes was. And so Alexander is making this really important point that is a common theme in my book, which is that we can't really do good science and understand other animals by studying in these really artificial, man-made environments that are restricted on so many levels, are sterile and uniform. Actually, if we want to understand their lives and who they are, then we have to study them in these complex socio-ecological environments. That's not only, of course, important from an ethical standpoint, which I think we all recognize, but it's also really, really important to do good science, which again is kind of counter to this whole norm that like, oh, the way we do good science is to do experiments and to study them in these highly controlled places where but no, that introduces bias and noise into the data of its own. And so these studies really showed that. And then, there's a kind of interesting um, set of papers that Alexander was writing about the way that we view addiction within vulnerable human populations as being some kind of biological inferiority that like, oh, for instance, Native Americans were just inherently susceptible to addictive substances when actually it had way more to do with the deprived social and physical environments they were forced to live in as a result of colonization. And that, you could look at current addiction problems with human beings, and you can really show that it also has so much. It doesn't just have to do with the addictive properties of the drugs, which is a part of it, but it also, and perhaps even more so, has to do with the broader social milieu. And so I think that that's such an important lesson. Again, now to zoom out to your bigger question of how like the role of our relationship with our surroundings, with other beings, be they human or otherwise, and then our kind of ecologies more generally, and how those shape our our experiences of the world. Of course they do. And we live, and we've been living for a while now in these societies that are characterized by more and more anthropogenic change and pollution and disturbance and habitat loss and fragmentation. And I think that you're absolutely right that so much of the kinds of mental health crises that we face today, loneliness becoming this epidemic, it's not merely because we're just all on our phones and behind our screens. It's also because we're not engaging with the more than human world. And not only are we not engaging with our fellow human beings as well as we should be, and as much as we should be in the ways that we could be, but what about the more than human world and all of the other forms of life around us? Imagine if we could see them as being neighbors and friends. Like, that would help the loneliness epidemic in a huge way. If we could really see all of these other forms of life as potential partners. And so again, it's a very hard thing to track, because it seems, it's just so big and it's so subversive, this disconnect that we have from nature. But there have been at least a number of studies that look at, the positive side of it, which is that more time spent in nature, like these green prescriptions where, it's like, if other traditional therapies don't work, go spend time in a forest, work with maybe therapy animals if it can be done in an ethical way. And having community gardens, like reducing rates of crime in neighborhoods. I mean, there's so many wonderful examples of the positive side of this relationship and the way that it can help that nature and contact with the environment and helping the environment can help human communities, and our own psychology. And it's just, that's, if there's anything that we need to be investing a lot of time and resources into, it seems to be preserving what we have left of that, and building more of it out so that those experiences are not lost even more.
Yes, I agree. And thank you for writing this book, An Arrogant Ape. I hope everybody listening goes out and gets it. It's really powerful, and I just appreciate the way that you talk about all of these issues. And it's not from a sort of recriminatory or recrimination, but a thought provoking. Sit with this thought, sit with this idea, and maybe and opening an invitation for people to reconsider where they currently are in relation to other beings, and if they inviting them to change that. And thank you for that. I really appreciate it, and thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for your great questions.
All right, that's it for today's episode of Wild Connection with Dr. Christine Webb. I hope this conversation sparked some new questions about where human exceptionalism might show up in your own life, and how looking at other species a little differently might change the way you move through the world. If you want to keep exploring these ideas, the next episode will be right up your alley, featuring marine mammal researcher Dr. Kevin Wu. We talk about how other species learn to navigate our very human built environments. I also want to share about a project that's very close to my heart. Recently, I led a lecture series on Star Island focused on what we can learn from other species to improve our lives, our relationships, our communities, and ultimately to reconnect with all the other beings we share this planet with. Those talks grew out of years of fieldwork and a deep belief that our well-being is intimately tied to the well-being of the more than human world. If you're interested in bringing these ideas into your organization, company, or community through workshops or professional development experiences around connection, empathy, and learning from other species, I'd love to work with you. You can reach out to me through my website, www.jenniferverdelin.com. Until next time, stay curious and stay connected. Thanks for listening.